Thanks, everyone. Thank you for all gathering here tonight, those people who are in attendance and those, of course, who are joining us online. We're about to commence the evening. I'll start with acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. I would also like to pay my respects to the custodians of the lands on which Macquarie University is situated on, the Wallamatical people of the Darug Nation. I also pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. So welcome everyone. This is the first Law and Nature Dialogue for 2023 from the Centre of Environmental Law, Macquarie University Law School. This is a different approach to the Law and Nature Dialogues to what we've taken in the past. Previously, the initiative that was first put into play by our former colleagues, Nenye Liu and Michelle Lim, was a format that was very much, I think, of its time. And of its time, I mean COVID and lockdown. We only ever saw speakers through Zoom. We never actually had a face-to-face law and nature dialogue. But since we have been able to come out of lockdown and again engage in conferences with face-to-face participants, my colleague Daly Burkett and myself, we thought, well, how can we really encourage the dialogue part of law and nature dialogues? And we have developed the format that you're all here to sort of see tonight. So we have, instead of paper presentations, we actually have a dialogue. We have 3 expert panelists who I'll introduce in a moment. And we are going to basically be talking through, as you know, the, well, upcoming or impending Nature Repair Market Bill. So the discussion will be centered around that bill, potential, piece of legislation, but also some other questions and comments around nature markets and biodiversity markets more generally. I'd like to thank the panelists for giving up their time to help us with this project. I'd like to thank the chair, Dr. Nicholas Brunton, as well for giving his time as well. I'll quickly just do an introduction and then I will hand over to Nick, who will then be guiding the discussion for the evening. So Nick is one of Australia's leading environment and planning lawyers based here in Sydney. Nick advises clients on areas of land acquisition, land use, development, planning, valuation, and compulsory acquisition, environmental, mining, and natural resources law. In addition to degrees in law and geography, Nick has a PhD in planning and environmental law from the University of Sydney. Nick is a member of our advisory board at CEL, Macquarie University. He's also on the advisory board for the Australian Centre of Climate Change and Environmental Law at the University of Sydney. He's a fellow of the Australian Property Institute and has delivered lectures at the University of Sydney and University of New South Wales and has over 30 peer-reviewed publications ranging from environmental planning and valuation law through to environmental economics. He has extensive experience in all forms of planning and environmental litigation, in addition to being a leading practitioner, as I said, in other areas related to environmental law. The first panelist, well, it's not really first panelist, I'm just going to go in the order that we have, sorry, is Dr. Megan Evans. Dr. Megan Evans is a senior lecturer in public sector management within the School of Business at the University of New South Wales, Canberra. She recently completed an Australian Research DECRA Fellowship, which examined the growth of private sector investment in biodiversity and natural capital. Megan also sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Conservation Letters. Ruth, who's our second panelist, again, just going in the order. Ruth Dawes is a Sydney partner in the Global Climate Change and Environment Group at Baker McKenzie, with over 20 years experience and expertise in all matters of climate change, ESD, biodiversity and environmental law. Ruth is passionate about assisting clients in their emission reduction strategies, programs, and projects in the transition to net zero carbon and sustainable futures, and has represented clients in the Land and Environment Court, Supreme Court, Court of Appeal, Federal Court, and the High Court. And Rachel Walmsley. Rachel Walmsley is a solicitor with the Environmental Defender's Office. Rachel has extensive experience in environmental policy and law reform. She has written and presented submissions and discussion papers and advised governments, parliamentary inquiries, and NGOs on a range of environmental law issues, including climate policy, natural resource management, and biodiversity laws. So the format quickly for the evening is, as I mentioned, I'm going to quickly pass over to Nick. Nick has a series of discussion points he's going to share with each of the panelists, and that will run to around 7 or just after 7, at which point we will open the floor to questions from people in the room and those online, and then we will wrap up at around 7:30. Just quickly before we start, I think, and having a chat to all the panelists a few moments ago, this is quite a timely, I think, a timely panel, a timely discussion. Not only is Australia at the federal level and inevitably at state levels moving towards environmental nature markets, we saw this as well, the endorsement of this idea at the back end of 2022 with the most recent decisions under the Convention on Biological Diversity and International Law. The Global Biodiversity Framework was explicit in its endorsement and promotion of certain market mechanisms, including offsetting. And that, in addition to the current Australian debate, I think sets the context very well for this evening. I'll now hand over to you, Nick, to take it from there.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome everybody online to this dialogue. It's really interesting and important time in nature conservation. We have a government now which appears to be reasonably motivated to do something about it. And it's an exciting time because we are seeing some pretty strong words and ideas and commitments coming out of Canberra for once. And of course, one that we want to talk a bit about tonight is this Nature Market Repair Bill, which sounds all pretty good when you read the objects of the Act. But the first question I have for our panelists, how's it actually going to work? And particularly you, Megan, if you could comment, what is the central thrust of the bill? What's the scheme? And how will it work if it's implemented?
Sure, Nick. This on. Apologies. Thank you. Big question to start with. If I may take it one step back and highlight the rationale for why we're having this market, why the government is introducing the market. The main reason for that has been said that we don't have enough public money to adequately invest in the environment in order to protect it properly. And scientific estimates have suggested that it would cost about $1 to $2 billion a year to protect our most threatened species and ecosystems, so those that are listed under the federal environmental law. Now, that's based on US spending. It could be more than $2 billion a year. Bearing in mind that the Australian public currently subsidises fossil fuel extraction to the tune of about $12 billion a year. So things are a little bit relative. So I just wanted to spell that out in terms of, we don't have enough money. Maybe that's not strictly correct. How it would work, the idea is generally that this market would incentivise First Nations and other landholders to do good things on the ground to protect biodiversity, ideally to restore biodiversity rather than just protecting existing what we have, because we need more biodiversity in the future than what we do now in order to meet our global biodiversity framework commitments. So this market is meant to incentivise those projects to start. And those projects, as they protect and restore biodiversity, those gains and benefits of biodiversity would be quantified and represented in a certificate, which purchasers, private firms, corporates, whoever, would purchase for reasons that aren't entirely clear yet, would purchase to demonstrate that, yes, we're doing good things for biodiversity. So that's the fundamentals. If that's okay, Nick.
Thank you, Megan. My next question is for you, Rachel. And Rachel, of course, is in the Environment Defender's Office and does a huge amount of fantastic work advocating both policy but also through legislation in the protection in this space. We've had here in New South Wales, Rachel, our biodiversity offset scheme for quite some time now, and it's a little bit controversial. What's your view on these biodiversity sort of credit generating schemes, and do, in your view, they actually contribute meaningfully to the protection of biodiversity?
Well, I'll start with being a bit positive, saying I absolutely agree with Megan that the environment biodiversity is chronically and consistently underfunded by government. So we need to find ways to get funding for conservation, particularly for all the biodiversity that lives on private land. Not everything is protected in a national park, so obviously we need funding. And one of the mechanisms that is very much in favour are markets. So markets are here to stay, whether you love them or hate them. But if we're thinking of the advantages and the disadvantages, starting with the positives, I think markets are a way to galvanise investment in conservation and stewardship on private land. They do provide an income stream for landholders in rural areas and also for First Nations communities. It can be really important. Previously, where there's no offset scheme in place, sometimes there would be an approval, habitat would be destroyed as part of the approval, and there would be no offset. So often department officials, when I'm being a bit harsh about offset schemes, they're like, well, at least something somewhere is getting some investment. So yes, there's a bit of loss over here, but at least we've got some money out of this deal to do something good somewhere. And so there are co-benefits that are possible, as I said, for cultural co-benefits, carbon co-benefits. There are a few things on the positive side of the ledger, but on the other side of the ledger, I am of the view that markets don't necessarily solve environmental issues. We can't assume that markets are going to be the big fix here or the silver bullet. The focus, in my experience, and you've mentioned the New South Wales scheme, the focus in setting up these markets, we start with a broad goal of, yes, we need some investment. This is going to create projects that are going to deliver outcomes. Once you get into it, it becomes very much focused on the process of setting up a market. Everyone becomes fixated on the market. How can we get participants in the market? How can we keep credit prices low so people will be involved in the market? And it all becomes about the trading. And in my experience, we really lose sight of the biodiversity outcomes. So there's actually a real lack of evidence to show that offsetting schemes work and they're actually delivering outcomes. There's a time lag between when you promise an offset and when an offset might actually deliver outcomes. Sometimes there's a condition of consent where an offset's required. That offset doesn't actually exist. 6 years later, a mine can't find that offset, so they just modify the condition. Like there's a lot of risks and a lot of variables built into the systems at the moment, whereby we don't actually see those environmental outcomes. And I think one of the things that's important to keep in the front of our minds when we're talking about this nature repair bill is, yes, we're talking about investment in nature, investment in conservation, but if this nature repair market is actually used as an offset scheme, then it is being used to justify habitat loss elsewhere. When you think about, the Task Force for Nature-related Disclosures and nature positive language and all the very fashionable language that we're hearing globally, that is about shifting global finance from environmentally negative outcomes towards environmentally positive outcomes. Remember, there are two sides of that. So yes, this market is aimed at directing finance to nature positive outcomes. But as Megan said, we are currently spending a lot of money on nature negative outcomes. So this market alone isn't going to really shift. It may do some good things, but the biggest problem with it is if it becomes an offset scheme, then there are some serious governance, accountability, transparency issues, in addition to the fact that it's unclear whether environmental outcomes will be delivered. So there's a whole lot to dig into in the discussion tonight on each of these factors. So it's good to bear in mind there are potential benefits from a scheme if it's just about investing in restoration. But if it goes straight to the offset scheme option, we are talking about net loss, we're talking about questionable gain. So it really is important to dig into these kinds of issues.
Fantastic way to raise the questions about how we're going to operationalise this and is it actually going to deliver a net positive outcome. Now, Ruth, you've been dealing with markets for a lot of your career. How do you see this bill and its structure based on your experience working? And do you think you could share any insights as to what a good market looks like compared to the framework proposed in this bill?
So, yeah, it's a loaded question. There's a lot to unpack in that. I think just going back to what Rachel said first, I think it's really important when we're talking about biodiversity to make that distinction between the difference of a biodiversity offset and a biodiversity credit or conservation unit. And I think, again, if we take a step back to the Dust-Buddha review in the UK, it was really urging everyone to start to look at what the economic value of nature is. And really that drive to think, well, if we can economically incentivize the investment in nature and make it more valuable than the removal of nature, then that's how we're going to solve the world's challenges in the conservation and enhancement of nature. And so this, and it's taking those concepts and then connecting them to the market mechanisms, as you say. And so what we're seeing in the market is, there's a bit to unpack in the order that we get to it. But essentially, there are entities out there that are looking to demonstrate how they will be achieving nature positivity. And we'll talk about the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures and the connections there to come. But we're seeing it's actually the investment in the conservation of nature that helps achieve that positivity. And it's a very, very different to just the traditional forms of biodiversity. And so the challenge for this current scheme, as Rachel's very clearly flagged, is which side of the pendulum is it going to swing to? Because if it's just steers in the direction of just enhancing the existing biodiversity offset tools, then it's going to be challenging to meet the international targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity. But if the pendulum's swinging towards being more akin to a conservation unit, then it has the ability to be such a tool. So all of that still needs to be worked out. And Megan's point around what claims can be made about the certificates, I understand the government's going to be releasing some guidelines on that. So that will be very interesting too. But how to make the market work, I mean, this is really going to be a challenge for everyone to think about. But we have seen in the past we have seen markets achieve environmental outcomes. If you take a step back to the US when they were having quite serious trouble with acid rain, it was an emissions trading market that managed to get those levels of acid rain down. And then that was the genesis for the EU ETS. It's a very different market to what we need for biodiversity because they were looking to reduce emissions. And here what we're wanting to do is the opposite. We're wanting to increase the biodiversity. But if we can figure out a way to build these mechanisms, then we can have the law around it to support it. And so we've got in front of us, one tool, which, as Megan said, is coming from a good place, at least, wanting to see the conservation in nature, but it's really about how we turn that into an economic tool that incentivizes pure conservation and doesn't fall into the trap that was mentioned before about it becoming just a pure offset scheme.
So we have a fairly consistent suite of concerns with this framework. And it seems from each of you that you're, okay, it might, but how's it going to work in practice? And we're very seemingly against the idea that this model be used to get a credit that then can offset damage. We want it to be a net positive And how do we do that? And how does what role is there in the government in investing here? Because you've written a bit about the need to get government investment in these markets.
Yeah, and if it's okay, I will backtrack again from that question, just because there's a lot of terminology in this space, and I think some might suggest that it could even be on purpose complex and confusing, just to make it sound like we're all doing good things. But as Rachel and Ruth were saying, the reason why it's concerning that there is discussion about the use of offsets in this market relates to what is the actual goal that we want to achieve. Nature positive isn't just a warm fuzzy term that means anything that sounds good for nature. If you hear someone say nature positive as an adjective, oh, that activity is really nature positive, that's not what it means. Nature positive is a net outcome. It is a noun. It is a future where, compared to a baseline of 2020, we have more nature than we do now. Net positive could mean something very different. Net positive could mean slightly better than business as usual. So it all depends on the baseline from which you measure it. Nature positive means we're here, we need to be here. Net positive could mean we're going to deliver a benefit that is slightly better than business as usual.
Which is going down.
Which is going down. So if you meet no net loss, if you meet an offset requirement, you are meeting no net loss relative to ongoing decline. So offsetting, if it works perfectly, at best maintains biodiversity decline. Okay?
Yeah.
If you have a net gain or net positive against that declining benchmark, you're going down a little bit less. So nature positive is a fundamentally different, far more ambitious net outcome than anything that we have attempted before. It is mathematically and physically impossible to get to that nature positive net increase in nature by offsetting. There has a place for it, but it can only be a very small role. So remind me of your initial question before I went on that rant. Apologies.
So there was a fantastic discussion because it actually is, we're heading down the trajectory. That's what the State of the Environment report says. So what's the point in just offsetting down that trajectory? We've got to still be on the disaster trajectory. Even if we offset slightly, we're still heading down. It's just going to take us longer to get there. So we actually need to have a quantum shift upwards and produce a net gain. So when we say a net
nature positive,
we have an estate already of protected areas. Is it to get nature positive about more of those areas on privately owned land? Tell us a bit about your thinking. What has to happen to get to nature positive?
Yeah, we need a lot more nature everywhere. And, most of Australia's nature and biodiversity is on private land. So we absolutely need more conservation, more restoration happening on private land. It doesn't make, we've managed to get close to meeting a lot of our protected area expansion targets under global agreements by putting a lot of very large protected areas out west and in the central parts of Australia. They are needed, but we also need a lot more in the east coast as well as in the west coast, where historically there's been a lot of loss. We need to restore nature where it has lost, and most of the time that is on private agricultural land. So we absolutely need to incentivize more landholders to do active restoration of nature. The issue is, how is that property rights that is issued by a market, whether it is a certificate or a credit, they are different things, and we can go into that if we want to. It depends on who buys that and what they use it for. If they buy that property right and say, isn't that wonderful that I bought that and I can demonstrate that I'm doing good things? Wonderful. if they use that property right to, oh, well, I've done some damage over here, or I know that Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures is coming in soon, and I might be caught under regulation again in future. I'm going to bank up a bunch of these credits and then cash them in later to compensate for losses elsewhere. That's not going to get us to nature positive. There's a role for some of that, but you know, we need to look at both sides of the equation, the incentive and the positive outcomes, as well as what is that being used for? Is it being retired and wonderful, good job, we did some good things, or cashed in to compensate for new biodiversity loss?
So I'm going to hit you up for a follow-up question now, Megan, and get you to explain what you mean by the difference between a credit and a certificate for the audience.
So a credit is, well, there's now seems to be more definitions with the voluntary credit space starting out. But for those in New South Wales, a credit, you know, in the New South Wales Biodiversity Offset Scheme, a credit is representation of a biodiversity gain. Okay, it's a measurable unit of biodiversity that represents these are the positive environmental biodiversity outcomes that have been delivered on this site. Wonderful.
I've got frogs, and
I have 20. I've got this population of abundance. So I've got 20 frogs. I've got 10 trees, and I grew those from a baseline of 0.
Yep.
So there's additionality.
Yep.
Okay.
So I've got my credits,
and I sell that to you, who has killed off a few frogs and trees. So the net outcome is 0, no net loss. A certificate is something different. A certificate is certification of an activity occurring. I have done some cool stuff. I haven't fully quantified the outcomes that have occurred, and it is a site-based thing that is issued once per project. Normally with carbon credits, with biodiversity credits, you issue however many credits that are generated from a site, however many new frogs that you grow or new trees that you grow, you get a credit. A certificate is issued once per site. And that made sense under David Littleproud's scheme, the Agricultural Stewardship Bill, which is the piece of legislation that the Nature Repair Market Bill is a copy and paste of. It made sense in that context because the certificate was meant to certify we have done some carbon credits here and we've done it in a particular way, and we're going to certify that these carbon credits are high quality, so we get a high price for those carbon credits. Okay, we're not disentangling the biodiversity and the carbon bits. We're not selling them separately. It's a premium carbon credit with certification that there's some cool stuff there. Unfortunately, the Australian government has heard about, I don't know where they got the idea from, but the same day that it was introduced, that they were introducing a nature market, the press release from the PM's office said biodiversity certificate market. Albo tweeted biodiversity credit market. Tanya Plibersek, the minister, did the same thing a few days later. So there seems to be some confusion about the difference. They both start with C. I understand certificate, credit, but they are different. And bringing back the offset issue, if we're talking about using these certificates as offsets, that is totally not fit for purpose. Totally not fit for purpose, because you might be exchanging quantified biodiversity losses with a certification of something happening but not necessarily delivering a measurable outcome. So that's a big issue.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. And I think that's, as you're saying, that's one of the challenges to how this will be an effective market, because the certificate, it's very difficult to see how you can then compare projects as well and the biodiversity that makes up that certificate. Whereas at least with biodiversity credits, you say, and even in the carbon credit market, there's ways to measure equivalence between separate units, and that's what's missing here. And then just to add some flavour around, what we would need for biodiversity enhancement. I mean, we're already starting to see in the market corporates wanting to purchase up large parts of land purely just to conserve the nature on that land and have the marketing rights in relation to that and the rights to any future biodiversity credits that could be generated, and just have those contractual rights. And then recently we saw through our international colleagues, they had quite an innovative debt for nature swap. So working with a country in the Galapagos to swap some of their sovereign debt for nature conservation. And so we're starting to see examples of tools of rather large conservation and having that investment behind it. And if you can have multiples of those at scale and potentially aggregate them and roll them out, plus a market with the credit type of unitization as well, all of those things together start to make some movement in terms of biodiversity conservation.
Rachel, let's go back in time, talk about old-fashioned command and control regulation. There was a time many years ago where there was a SEP about land clearing in New South Wales, which was really quite strict. That thou shalt not, unless with development consent, clear vegetation, and a lot of people got upset by that. Is there still a role in your mind for prescriptive regulation saying you can't clear here because of its impact on biodiversity? What's your view on that?
Yes, but to elaborate, absolutely, there is a role for a whole range of levers and a whole range of tools to be used to get us to nature positive. This market alone, as Megan's quite eloquently shown, will not get us there. I think one of the big issues here is the government has put the cart before the horse. We've got a review of national environmental law. Our national law is 20 years old. It's not fit for purpose. They've committed to making a nature positive new act. They need to do that first, which includes putting in place parameters about clearing. It includes putting in place red lights where you actually cannot destroy some habitat. If it's so rare, there's hardly any left. There should be categories that cannot be offset, that cannot be cleared. And I think that would actually give certainty to business, to proponents, to have really clear rules. Actually, this area is too precious. Don't bother putting in a DA for this because it's just going to be a quick no, go elsewhere. I think that would help with certainty. What we've got is a 20-year-old act in 1,000 pages that doesn't mention climate change. It's full of discretion. It's full of so many loopholes. Some clauses are excellent in the Act and they've barely ever been implemented. So we really need to do this reform properly. If the government is serious about being nature positive, we need a new National Environment Act that actually explicitly says what nature positive means, puts those regulatory settings in place, the red lights, because markets, as I said earlier, don't necessarily deliver outcomes. So they need guardrails, they need no-go zones, they need kind of the parameters to be set because they are just one tool in the toolbox. And you do need compliance enforcement, you do need the old command and control and really, really clear rules. One of the good things about the nature positive reforms the government has committed to is they're actually working on developing national environmental standards. Ideally, these standards would be strong and clear and actually set some of these rules and focus on environmental outcomes. That's a huge part of what's been proposed. One of these standards that we're working on literally right now is an offset standard. So it begs the question, why are we charging ahead with a nature repair bill that's actually being listed for this sitting week and next sitting week in Parliament, when we're still talking about the architecture of a national offset standard, when we haven't even established the new independent EPA as a regulator, when we haven't actually got the fundamentals in place first? By all means, explore what a market can do, but I think we need to start with getting a new Nature Positive Act in place first with some really, really strong, legally enforceable national standards.
Let's talk a little bit more about these national standards, and I open this discussion up to anyone who wants to talk about it. What is the breadth of those standards? What are they going to cover, and what are they going to be used for? Megan, do you want to have a crack?
Yeah, well, there's only been one draft standard released publicly so far, and that was the overarching standard for all matters of national environmental significance. There's going to be a standard for environmental offsets, and I believe several others that Rachel or Ruth might want to mention. So, you know, Rachel's point that we do need to, you know, embed nature positive, if that is a goal that, you know, we want to achieve in the way that it's actually meant to be, rather than some vague term. That draft standard that has been publicly released had a really vague description of what nature positive was. It was, you know, a future where things are being repaired and restored, and it's a responsibility of communities, governance, businesses, etc. So there was no fixed time point. If we want, you know, smart targets, specific, measurable, you know, realistic, time bound, there was no time points. There was nothing to measure. It was extraordinarily vague. And in my view, it would simply just operationalize business as usual. It was really just copy and paste nature positive a bunch of times into what we already have seen. And then, you know, hope for the best. So yes, things absolutely do need to be strengthened, but then, you know, the devil is in the detail. One of the details, and has been, you know, indicated in the nature positive plan that was released in December last year, was they described it as a strengthening of the mitigation hierarchy, but also that if you can't find an offset for a species or ecosystem because it's probably quite rare and maybe we can't find an offset, you don't need to find an offset now. You can make a conservation payment for a better overall environmental outcome. Better for who? Which species? Who's going to decide what is better? How are they going to decide? Okay, so it's my view and a lot of my colleagues that this is actually a concerning policy regression that has been kind of cloaked in cute, fuzzy language. So, and again, how do you actually operationalize it? A little bit unclear based on what we've got, but, you know, from my experience, you know, studying how these processes work, I suspect what will happen is, oh, we can't find an offset. Oh, okay, well, we'll put money into a fund, and then that fund can be spent on anything. Doesn't have to be that particular matter of national environmental significance. So, and how is that going to link to the nature repair market? We don't know yet, because we're putting the bill through first, and then all of the detail, don't worry, it'll come out in the delegated legislation.
I think just to add to that, another thought in terms of linkages is just how that sits under the global biodiversity framework as well, because there we've got, I think, 23 targets, and one of them, when it comes to things like threatened species, as you said, is to have zero loss. And so we've got our international commitments and questions around how we implement those domestically. And with the change in government that we spoke about at the outset, we now have our Climate Change Act, where our nationally determined contribution is enshrined in legislation. So we've moved down that direction for climate, but we haven't, from a statutory perspective, moved down that direction yet for biodiversity and nature. So I think we as a country have to think, well, what are those commitments that we're making, and are we going to enshrine those in a similar statute?
Which kind of brings us to the topic, and regrettably we weren't able to have a member of our Indigenous community here tonight to talk about Indigenous perspectives on this topic, and it's probably going to be a subject for another session. But what I wanted to talk now about is a slight divergence, because what's proposed in the bill struck me as rather curious as to who's going to regulate this market. And it seemed that the idea was going to be that we have a clean energy regulator regulating biodiversity. What's your take on this, Rachel?
Well, we don't think that the clean energy regulator should be the regulator for environmental offsets because they don't have the expertise. They weren't established to do biodiversity offsetting. And it's a very, very different thing to a carbon offsetting scheme. I think the idea has been a lot of the provisions in the Nature Repair Bill are based on the Carbon Farming Bill. The regulator's already in place. So the government seems to be attempting to just add biodiversity to the list of the things that the clean energy regulator does. And again, we're putting the horse before the cart because as you may all know, you may have read the Chubb review report, there are some serious governance, accountability issues and real question marks about whether the carbon market is delivering outcomes, particularly for a couple of types of the credits under that market, the human-induced regeneration, for example. There's question marks over the clean energy regulator doing their job in relation to carbon credits. So before fixing all those problems and addressing the recommendations of Chubb, the government is suggesting giving that regulator an alternate, like an additional job for which they have no specific expertise at this stage. Like the bill talks about greenhouse gas auditors auditing a biodiversity certificate. What do they know about that? It seems a very rushed add-on to do, to just add to a regulator that is already addressing some of its own problems. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about doing these reforms properly. So the government has committed to a new independent Environment Protection Authority agency at the national level. So if that is established properly in law, then that is an environmental regulator. And if the nature repair market is just about certificates for investment and restoration, then absolutely the Environmental Protection Agency would be the appropriate regulator because they've got the expertise. If this is all about offsetting and the new EPA is actually the assessor and the approver and therefore puts offsetting conditions onto projects, then that raises a question because you would then have an EPA generating offset requirements, but then at the same time regulating a market where the demand is driven by offsets. So that becomes a bit muddier with the conflicts. And then you have the fact that the Commonwealth is a major purchaser of these certificates. So you need to separate which bit of government's doing the purchasing, which independent agency is doing the assessment and approval, including offset conditions, which bit of the government is setting the standards for offsetting, which bit of the government is doing related schemes like carbon. When we talk about co-benefits, how do we do these co-benefits? None of this has really been thought through in a coordinated way. So one of EDO's main recommendations is just pause this bill, sort out the framework of how the new regulator is actually going to work, how the new national standards are going to work before adding onto the clean energy regulator a task for which they are not designed.
And Ruth, in your experience, would you agree with the view expressed about the clean energy regulator not being the ideal vehicle here as a regulator?
Well, I think it's not so much a question of ideal or not. It's really like there's some real challenges, as Rachel said, as the Chubb review identified as well at the beginning of the year in terms of resourcing and stretching of resourcing. And I think all the points that Rachel made are really valid in terms of what is the framework, what are the roles, what are the responsibilities. So I think that before we can even answer your question so much, I think those sorts of threshold questions really need to be worked through.
I've got a couple of reasons to add why I also agree that I don't think the clean energy regulator is the appropriate regulator for this new market. From last week, or this week actually. So as we know, we've got the safeguard bill that went through with agreement with Labor and the Greens. Part of that agreement was that Minister Chris Bowen was to direct the Clean Energy Regulator to administer the human-induced regeneration method in accordance with its method, administer it according to the recommendations of the Chubb Review, recommendations 8.1 and 8.2. And that recommendation was issued 9th of May, so a couple of weeks ago. You can find it on the website. There's no media release, but if you search, recommendation 8.1, 8.2 on the Clean Energy Regulator website, you can find how they're planning to respond to that direction. And it's a several page document, and it essentially several times places the onus back on proponents to provide sufficient evidence that suppressors or those things that are stopping forests from regenerating on these sites, they need to provide sufficient evidence that those suppressors are, present. Nothing about whether those sites actually have potential to grow forest. If you have a look at a map of where these forests are being regenerated, they are largely in semi-arid areas. They are near Lake Eyre, just south of Alice Springs, even up north. My geography is not great, but kind of west of Broome, really, not really areas where you would expect to find permanent, even-aged native forest. Those words are important. Permanent means there's a fair bit of rain, so we're not going to die as boom bust drought goes through. They're even-aged because they have started to grow at the same time, which usually occurs after you bulldoze it all at the same time. That is how that method is meant to be interpreted. There doesn't appear, for a very long time, colleagues and I, Professor Andrew McIntosh and others at the ANU have been pointing this out, that you can't grow permanent even-aged native forest in semi-arid locations. And so far, there is still no indication from the Clean Energy Regulator that they plan to even examine whether these sites have the capacity to grow forest. Because you could demonstrate that there was some kind of, cows or sheep or whatever suppressing vegetation, and there might be some vegetation grow back, that's great. But they're not going to grow to the size and permanence that equates to a carbon credit to offset permanent fossil fuel release. Stuff can grow, but not to the amount that is being credited for. That's why we've argued that there are too many credits being issued to these projects. So that is another reason, that there's been a pause on crediting for those projects. But my fear is that it'll be, yes, we've had a look at all of this big data. They say big data, whatever that means. We've had a look at all this evidence. Yes, we're satisfied. All right, unpause crediting, off we go. That is my fear. I very much hope that it is not founded.
One question, I guess, is a fairly open one to you all. We've seen in other areas some massive failures. Water is one. Australia's not very good at managing its water. Murray-Darling Basin Agreement, Commonwealth Water Act, in theory, looked like good legislation, but in practice, the politics got in the way. To what extent can you foresee that the politics at the federal level will get in the way of a good outcome through this bill, if it gets passed? Perhaps I throw that one first to you, Rachel.
I think it's always a massive risk in Australia, the politics in terms of environment and climate policy. So, it is, I think the genesis of this bill does ring alarm bells, because it was a Minister Littleproud bill under a former government with a slightly different purpose. It was literally cut and paste into a new bill with a few tweaks. It's being introduced before the bigger reforms are happening. So it's a really curious political process why this is happening at the moment. I think often when when the environmentally idealistic and the goals that we strive for in environmental policy, often when they're derailed, it's when really strong lobby groups come in and have the ear of the government and manage to water down an environmental protection or undermine it in some way. It's a bit unclear here when you talk to the different stakeholders in this process, like we've talked to private investors, like banks and so forth. They're kind of interested in this. They want to be doing the good thing, but they are skeptical in terms of why would we buy these certificates if we don't have to? What exactly are we buying for our money? If we buy these certificates, will the EDO corporate team do us for greenwashing? Like, they're genuine concerns because there's just not enough detail out there. But I think then you have, the development industry, the mining industry, who do want to be able to do an offset. And more than that, they want to be able to do offsets where offsets aren't available. They want to be able to do a conservation payment, as Megan mentioned before, to facilitate the quicker approval and get it done, give money to something good happening somewhere else. So there are a number of kind of pressures at play. And I think some of the policy objectives are really getting mixed up here, like, the fundamental difference between a credit and a certificate and, the restoration stewardship project as compared to an offsets project. So there is a lot of muddying of the waters, and the politics will be interesting. So as you probably know, this bill is going to a Senate inquiry. It's likely to be rushed through the House, and the opposition is going to support it because it's essentially their bill. So they'd look silly if they didn't. But it's going to go to the Senate, and through that inquiry process, I think a lot of these issues are going to be fleshed out, and we'll see how the politics is playing out there. And you can, inquiry hearings are often live streamed, so you can probably watch Megan hold forth, and we'll be saying similar things through that political process and trying to get, at least if we can't delay the bill, at least get amendments and try and fix some of this uncertainty, try and get a bit more clarity. And I think, there'll be, with the makeup of the Senate and the makeup of the Parliament now, I think obviously the Teals are into integrity and governance, that they're going to be asking questions, I would imagine, about the governance of this and the environmental outcomes. So it'll be an interesting process going through the Senate inquiry.
I have a question for you again, Megan. If you propose a development in the Sydney water catchment, there's a rule that you have to demonstrate a neutral or beneficial impact. Do you think a similar concept could work here in the biodiversity space? If you had a project that was needed an approval and the approval body said, well, proponent, that sounds a great idea, you might want to build your mine or grow a crop of cotton, whatever it is. But you have to demonstrate to me as the regulator at least a neutral or a beneficial impact. And given your trajectory earlier, what's your view on whether that type of regulatory model?
That's what we've got already. Biodiversity. And what were the terms that you use in the water example?
Neutral or beneficial? Neutral
or beneficial. So under the EPBC Act Environmental Offsets Policy that has been around since 2012, the words are maintain or improve. It's pretty much the same as net gain, net positive, or no net loss. They all mean the same thing. It's just different terminology, but it matters what is that baseline. Right. So under the EPBC Act offset policy, the baseline is decline. So if you maintain the net, if it's a net neutral outcome, you're still maintaining existing loss. If you improve, then you're getting a slight shifting of it. I don't know what the baseline is in your water example. If it's a fixed baseline improvement, oh, great. If it's maintaining, okay, cool. That's a bit better than a declining, counterfactual. Right. So yes, that is the system that we have for biodiversity, and there's over 100 countries around the world that have implemented the mitigation hierarchy and biodiversity offsetting and all of that. But as Rachel said, the evidence for whether or not these offsets actually deliver what they say on the tin as in no net loss or net gain or whatever, there's very little evidence to say whether we're getting those outcomes that are promised. And a lot of that is because of lack of transparency in governance. You know, some colleagues and I tried to find information about effectiveness of these 100 policies around the world. I think we've found about 10 public registers of information, and none of them had sufficient information to know whether or not we're getting those outcomes. When I was doing my PhD 10 years ago, I was doing an internship in the Federal Environment Department, and I said, I'll collect all your data, you know, I'll come up and help with your database, you know, naively. We had under that 2012 policy, it was promised that we would get a public register of offsets. Remember that? Where is it? So, yeah, there's a lot of these market-based mechanisms. I have a lot of pet peeves, but one of my pet peeves is innovative market mechanism, innovative financial instrument. What does that mean? It usually just means offset. So we like to introduce lots of cool terms to make us sound like we're doing something new, but we're actually just doing the same thing we've been failing at for the last 40 years. Sorry, that got a bit dark, but I guess, you know, these market mechanisms are also meant to act as incentives. So the purpose of an offset, if an offset is expensive, that's usually a sign that, oh, that bit of biodiversity is a bit scarce. Economists like to talk about scarcity. If that's really expensive to offset, maybe that's an indication. It's not a regulatory stick, but it is a market signal that, oh, don't touch that, it's scarce. If you clear that bit of habitat, that species is toast. Instead, what happens in New South Wales is we have a credit supply task force where we need to find lots of credits to facilitate, you know, the development that we need to do. At the federal level, it's, we've been applying these offset calculations after approval anyway. So it's already approved, oops, sorry. And now we're going to say, if you can't find an offset, just pay into this fund, and it doesn't need to be like for like. Sorry, Region Honeyeater. We only committed to net or to zero new extinctions by 2030. So we've got 7 years to, you know, kill as many of you as we can.
And I think just to add to that, look, the challenge in Australia, this whole area, it's very complex, very challenging. And I think, as Rachel was saying, like there's a bit of thought that needs to be done about what the parameters are for development and its interrelationship with biodiversity. And, you know, you mentioned the concept of the no-go zones and, you know, having these studies of where are all our rare honeyeaters and, you know, and some of the work's done, but it's piecing it together and then trying to work out how that fits in with our objectives as a nation for infrastructure and in particular energy transition infrastructure, because there are still some things we're going to need to do in terms of development to address the challenges of climate change, but we need to be addressing those in the context of the impacts of nature as well. And there's no easy answer to that. And I think I really do like your point, Rachel, about some further thought and thinking going into that and how that's going to play out, because as you were saying, Megan, like if you're just readily just reverting to funds or instantly to offsets without doing that pre-thinking about how this is all going to fit together, I think that's really where it gets quite complex.
All right, we're close to our hour up now, and we're very privileged actually to have in the audience one of the fathers of environmental law here in Australia, looking down the back there, Dr. Jerry Bates, who's had, of course, nearly 40 odd years of experience in environmental regulation. Jerry, I might throw over to you whether what you've heard tonight strikes any memory bells and what your perspective is. Yeah.
Well, I was actually on the board of the EPA at one stage, and that's when the offset proposals were introduced. And they were introduced by the economics branch of the EPA, which always raises a bit of a red flag. And I'll state my position straight away. I hate offsets. I would not have a bar of them because, as Rachel said earlier, it gives the decision maker an excuse to say yes to a project to which they should actually say no. There's one thing though, there is an elephant in the room with this new bill, and that's, I think it's section 17, which says in order to even take part in the federal scheme, you have to jump the hurdle of passing all through the regulatory provisions of state and territories to start with, right? And I'll give you an example of why it's an issue. I work with the Malone Institute, which is land rehydration initiative, which operates out of Bungendore near Canberra. And we have a project down in southern New South Wales to bring back a landowner, who wants to exercise stewardship over his own property, wants to bring back the golden, the bellfrog, the green and gold bellfrog. Yep. And it's basically the last chance. It's the last remaining population down there. And in fact, in the latest census, we couldn't even find it. So anyway, we've got this project to rehydrate the landscape, which would bring back biodiversity of all shapes and sizes, which are what we prove in a lot of our projects. But because we are in a situation where there is potentially, and there is green and gold bellfrog habitat, we have to jump through the hurdles of about 6 different regulators. And that means tens of thousands of dollars on assessments and time lags and whatever, which is what we find with all or most of our projects. But this particular one, the offset regulator is asking for $600,000 for an offset in order to do work that will actually repair the habitat for the green and gold bellfrog. That's your problem. A lot of these authentic repair projects, such as the ones that we carry out to rehydrate the landscape, cannot get through this process. So we couldn't even get through into the federal scheme. So until there's some sort of connection between federal policy and state regulation, there's going to be an elephant in the room a lot of the time with these things.
Does anyone on the panel have any comment about the issues raised by Jerry?
I won't speak to the policy of coherence other than saying, yes, policy coherence is great. But I think your case highlights a market participation issue.
Yeah.
And this is one of the, I don't know if it's in the objects, but it's one of the things that the government is saying. We need to get more people participating in this market. We need small and medium-sized projects coming in because we need more and more private land doing cool things. The lack of public money, the zero public money that is being put on the table to actually start this market, because the onus is being placed on the private sector to purchase certificates without. How are people like you and others like you meant to find the resources to start these projects? It's a loop. Oh, but you get the money when you sell the certificate, but you need some, you need more than $0 to actually do the work to generate the certificate, and you're not going to get a certificate overnight. So
the funny thing about this project is the Environmental Trust in New South Wales gave us $100,000 for the project. And then the Biodiversity Regulator is saying, entirely separately, you need $600,000 worth of offsets.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other mess. But I mean, in terms of market participation, if the government truly does want to bring in those who don't have that existing market power, such as those who are already got a lot of projects in the carbon market and don't need that startup money, there needs to be some public money to actually support small and medium-sized groups to start these projects. And a Labor state government did exactly that in the Queensland Land Restoration Fund, kickstarting the market. It's there, you can just do a good copy and paste of that example about how you actually start these markets off and bring in those who are currently don't have the skills and resources in the fold.
It reminds me when you say that, Megan, of land care. We used to have a really good land care scheme, which was well funded and really encouraged local communities to get together and preserve local areas. but that funding just dried up. You're going to say something, Ruth?
Oh, I'll need to second that. Like the Land Restoration Fund is a very good example of a fund to get land-based carbon sector projects off the ground, but also with a very high focus on co-benefits. So co-benefits to First Nations communities, to improvements to the Great Barrier Reef, to biodiversity and the like. So like you said, there's an example sitting there that is transferable to biodiversity as well.
And for the audience, tell us a little bit how that works.
I used to work in that team, just full disclosure. So that was
A well-directed question then.
yeah, 2017 Queensland State Labor government promise was $500 million to start this land restoration fund. The idea is we're going to use existing market infrastructure, which is the carbon credits legislation, and we're going to put in a bunch of public money to generate high quality carbon credits that come with all these co-benefits. None of this, we don't need certificates. It's just, we have on the public register, we add an extra column in the Excel spreadsheet and it says, these are the co-benefits that were delivered. We didn't need to make a whole other new property right to demonstrate that there were co-benefits. So yeah, there was a few different funding streams that came out. There was a Kickstarting the Market one, there was something else, but went through a tender process where you could say, this is the project that we're planning on doing, this is our plan, these are the co-benefits that we want to deliver. And then the government had a list of priorities that were their public investment priorities. And then there was, a selection process where it was, okay, our government priorities are water quality, First Nations, biodiversity. These people have got costed plans for what they're going to do. They're asking for this amount and, a small profit margin, or, this is what they're going to deliver. Great, we'll give them some startup money and then they'll pay us back on at least some of it with some premium carbon credits that we're going to store in our government war chest, or maybe on sell, whatever. But, this is Queensland government realising that they actually own quite a few dirty assets. So they could use those carbon credits, but also, we've got some co-benefits and they're actually net gain rather than we're going to trade these biodiversity bits to offset biodiversity losses. That's the beauty of a bundled carbon credit with something else on the top. You can't separate them, so you can't sell them for someone else to use in exchange for loss elsewhere. So that property right, and whether you actually need a property right, needs some thought as well.
Your example, Megan, reminds me of various initiatives that we've had, and many countries have them, of sovereign wealth funds. Australia has a future fund, which goes and invests money. But it doesn't seem to invest in any of these meaningful biodiversity or ecosystem positive schemes. Is there a role, in your view, Rachel, for a more prescriptive way how public money is spent in these type of future fund models that exist?
I'm not sure if that's a question for me or a question for Ruth in terms of the big money. But again, I think just stepping back a bit, one of the things that annoys me when, when Tanya Plibersek first said at Green Wall Street, that this is going to galvanise all the funding, it was like somehow that meant that the government doesn't have to do the core funding and provide, like the Queensland government did in that example. So to me, I think that the government still has to increase their funding in environmental, and they need to do that core funding. They need to provide the seed funding. They cannot step away from that with fancy mechanisms, future funds and all sorts of, I think that is still a core requirement. And if we do a new national act properly and we set up an EPA properly, then with well-designed law that links to budget line items that have to be put in there, they can't abrogate the funding responsibilities totally. But again, that comes back to designing an integrated package of laws that's actually going to deliver the outcomes. Do you want to comment on the sovereign wealth?
Thank you. I think look, there's the role for government investment, probably also institutional investors. Obviously, will be interested in not just how they achieve climate change challenges, but also the challenges of addressing nature and nature positivity. We've got big multilateral organisations around the world that also will be looking at this. And I guess one thing to think about, and it's something just sort of popped in my head from something you were saying, Rachel, was we've seen coming out of the Paris Agreement negotiations, the Article 6 framework, which again is bringing market-based mechanisms to the transfer of mitigation outcomes between countries through a cooperative approach. There's no reason why we couldn't start to think more broadly about whether we bundle biodiversity objectives in those sorts of initiatives, and certainly open to the participating countries to do so with broader sustainable development mechanisms, or whether we see, another sort of similar framework from a biodiversity perspective. But in the Article 6 world, we're seeing country to country negotiate for not just one sort of project, but a series of projects and scaling them, and there's potential to aggregate them as well. And I think that's a point that you sort of touched on originally, Megan's having that sort of aggregation of larger projects. So so there's the frameworks, and then getting the money behind it, government will be a part of that as well.
All right, now I might throw open to our wonderful audience here and ask if anyone has any questions for the panel before we wind up. Anyone want to have a crack? Welcome, big loud voice so everyone can hear.
Yes, my name is Elise Cleese. I'm a partner at Shaw Reynolds Lawyers. I think that you've already touched on it a bit about other examples, and the example in Queensland, Megan, that you were talking about. I'm interested in whether you can talk a bit about maybe one or a couple of you, the successful biodiversity markets overseas, and if you have seen it done successfully. And I can see, Megan, you're just thinking, oh no, there's nothing.
It's a really common question and very, very understandable. And the kind of horrifying reality is that we are the example.
Wow. Wow.
Australia is, and it depends on, how do you define best example? Australia is usually highlighted in a lot of the kind of non-peer reviewed literature that, we were the first to really start getting into this space, because we don't really have any evidence of whether they work or not because of the lack of data and that kind of thing. How do you find examples to transfer policy? Oh, well, Australia's been doing it for a while. We've got a long history of engaging in environmental markets, not just biodiversity. Biobanking New South Wales, that was one of the first. It's now Biodiversity Conservation Trust. So in terms of examples from elsewhere, sorry, it's it's kind of, we have been experimenting and with market-based instruments for biodiversity for 20, 30, nearly 40 years in this country. The US has species habitat banking. Evidence in terms of effectiveness also unclear. They don't really have additionality as a principle either. So they've been doing it for a long time as well. I think it's since the 70s. But again, how do you actually evaluate whether it's good or not? It's hard when there's little, if ever, public data provided.
There's the UK scheme as well. But that's
Yes.
Hello. My name is Alex Banks. I'm a partner at the EY Climate Change and Sustainability Practice. I actually have two questions for you. First one, I was watching the Bob Brown documentary a couple of weeks ago, Giants, where they talk in part about the Tasmanian Dams case, and it made me feel very nostalgic for being a little, environmental law student back in the day. But it got me thinking a little bit about.
I was a protester then. That's how old I am.
On you, about what the future of that kind of activist litigation, I guess, looks like in Australia, and do you have a view on whether we're going to see that in relation to the global biodiversity framework and or things like the UN recognition of the human right to a clean environment. And then my second question is about natural capital accounting and whether you have a view on that. The obviously the BHP natural capital account came out recently. Liverset committed to an Australian natural capital account in Montreal last year. Yeah, keen for your views on natural capital accounting and how you think it kind of plays into this market mechanism space.
So for litigation, I think we are going to continue to see public interest groups. Like we had the Sharma case with, the children representing or children under the age of 18 in that decision, go forward with various challenges to government and to corporates. And I can't see any reason why there wouldn't be those sorts of challenges from a biodiversity perspective as well. So I think it is watch this space and one that most firms are out there are monitoring.
Do you think and sorry to just a follow-up question, do you think the Tasmanian Dams case provides sufficient precedent for something like the global biodiversity framework? Because I think the really interesting thing about Tasmanian Dams was that it was about a specific project, and we're going to see over the next 7 years project after project after project that will limit our ability to meet the GBF commitments. So are we going to start seeing again less, and I don't want to call the kind of broader environmental litigation more esoteric, but like rather than it being kind of conceptual and the rights of children, etc., it will be more about like particular projects and protesting against the impacts of the ability to impact our meeting of the GBF. And of course, GBF is not as binding as the international law that was used for Tasmanian Dams, but
yeah, I mean, if you look at the New South Wales Land and Environment Court and the history of development applications for coal mining projects and the like, there's been a real evolution in the case law and authority that's come out of that particular court, including the incorporation of consideration of international commitments under UNFCCC. And so I think the parallels you're drawing to biodiversity and the conventional biological diversity are the right ones. We're probably over time going to see a similar evolution to challenges to projects in terms of how they fit in with international commitments under biodiversity law. So yeah, no, I think your points are valid.
Now, Megan, you're going to grapple with the natural capital
account.
Yeah.
Any accountants in the room?
I work for an accounting firm, but I'm not an accountant.
Alex,
Yes.
why do we do accounting?
It's actually, I love that you asked that because I've been thinking about this in relation to TNFD as well and trying to explain why I have such an issue with the TNFD metrics right now. And I was talking
just for the audience.
Yeah.
Explain an acronym.
Okay, so TNFD is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. It's basically saying that companies should understand their impacts and dependencies on nature and try to work out if they could translate into material financial risks and opportunities. And I was having this conversation with this big group of these like fancy accountants in our firm recently because with the ISSB, which is another acronym, International Sustainability Standards Board, they're doing climate now and they're saying biodiversity is going to be next. And they're saying that they're going to align it to the TNFD. So it's really important that we are aware of what the TNFD is saying about disclosure because it could be regulated literally within 3 years. And what I said to them, and I think this is mostly true, is that what the TNFD is currently suggesting is the equivalent of a financial ledger that has all of the profits and all of the losses, but it doesn't actually net that out into an overall profit statement. So it has all of the income streams, it has all of the expenses, but it doesn't actually add it up and say, is there a profit or is there a loss at the end of the day? And when you think about that for nature, so what they're saying, the TNFD, is like companies should be doing all of these calculations about what's coming in and what's going out, what they're doing, what they're not doing, but they shouldn't have to, at the end of the day, say, are we making a net positive impact on nature or a net negative impact on nature? And that is so problematic. It's so important. And so natural capital accounting is going to be one of the things that they start putting in these ledgers of saying, look at all of this income we have from nature. And it's like, yeah, but what about the losses and what's the net impact of that?
I'm going to bring it back even simpler. Why do we do accounting other than to employ accountants? I'm not being mean. Why do we do it? Why is it important to know whether we have more or less of something?
Well, the idea is what gets measured gets managed.
Wonderful. So there might be some kind of decision. Okay. I am not dissing the concept of accounting or natural capital accounting at all. I'm just suggesting that a lot of the time, or with all of the acronyms and the disclosure and the risks, and we need to do this because we might get regulated and we all need to do this right now. Why are we doing it? It's because we might need to make a decision about not financing stuff that harms nature and putting more finance into stuff that helps nature. So I like accounting. I think it's important. I think when it can be used to make decisions, it is useful. But if it becomes accounting for accounting's sake, and quite frankly, national accounts of environment, cool. But you know, we already know that things are not great. So in terms of, you know, making decisions, for example, development decisions under the EPBC Act, national accounts, national environmental accounts, like Minister Plibersek announced, they're not going to help that particular decision. Okay? So how much information do we really need, you know, under different circumstances to make decisions about whether, you know, this activity or this activity is the appropriate one? We need to think about the purpose of doing an account at an appropriate scale.
And don't we already do that through State of the Environment reporting?
Ideally, sort of, but not really, no, because we haven't invested in environmental infrastructure for the last 4 decades. So we've got a lot of cool information out there. It's just going to take a bit of time and money to bring it together. And we do have things like Atlas of Living Australia. We've got the Threatened Species Index. So a lot of very clever scientists have come up with a Threatened Species Index. And, you know, that didn't, you know, yeah, it was a bit of time and a lot of work. That was all collating all of the existing data that we already have. You know, we can actually invest in, you know, rolling that kind of thing out at different scales. And that kind of stuff can help our decisions. But a lot of the time there's a crap load of information out there sitting in environmental impact statements in a black hole in the Environment Department that have been kind of sitting there over the last 20 years of environmental approvals, that someone needs to like get out the PDF and extract some of that data because it's not actually in any kind of usable form.
I just add to that, part of the new Nature Positive plan is that there's going to be an environmental data office, and there's going to be improvements in access to information. And apparently the environmental data office will be called EDO. That's problematic. I'm supportive of it, but choose a new acronym. Yeah, I think that kind of information that can only get better because it's pretty woeful at the moment. I just wanted to go back to your comment about litigation, Tasmanian dams. One other thing that made me think of the Tasmanian Dams case was also about Commonwealth leadership in relation to international obligations. And you're exactly right. We've now got new biodiversity obligations at the international level. And we've got a new government who has said we're taking this seriously. There will always be public interest litigation, and it's an essential part of good environmental policy. So I think there will be that project by project litigation where necessary, where laws aren't applied. But I think there is an opportunity with the sculpting of these new laws, the commitment to make national environmental standards, that the bar could be raised. So the government is saying we'll have new national environmental standards for these matters of national environmental significance. Any state or territory who wants to be accredited will have to meet these standards. So if Tasmania was, about to approve a dam and they weren't meeting the national standards, of course there would be litigation again. And the government has also committed to keeping third-party rights, keeping standing, keeping the accountability measures in new law, because they are a fundamental part of, they're a check and balance to make sure that new laws are absolutely working. But you do need the data and the information, because we can put laws in place, but we need to constantly check that the new laws are actually working, they're being implemented, they're being enforced, because we want to be able to one day pick up a state of the environment report and actually read some good news. So we need good laws in able to be able to do that. We need adaptive laws, because like with the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, we are running out of time for a number of species. So there's a whole range of mechanisms and institutions that need to be put in place now. A nature repair market is one small aspect, and in no way is it a solution. But I think tonight's illustrated there's so many different parts that really need to be thought through, and we've got an opportunity to do this properly.
One final question.
I'm Judith Preston. I just wanted to make a few points in relation to what you were saying. Firstly, about the dams case was fairly unique, and Jerry Bates will add to this information, because they had all the circumstances to make specific legislation. They had the support of the lower house and the upper house, so that was able to be seamlessly passed at the time. And also you mentioned the Land Environment Court they have a different set of judges that seem to have a better set of environmental knowledge than maybe you might say as a general group of federal court. So we don't necessarily think that decisions at federal level might get through to the keepers. As we saw in the Sharma case, one judge thought one thing, and when we got to the appeal court, judges had different views, and they took a very conservative approach. I mean, I don't want to put cold water on the idea that we might have good decisions, but that could be a problem. The second thing I'm thinking about these national standards, you really need to link the standards and the positive duties of the decision makers to make sure that they have to take the national standards into account when they're making decisions, because if there's as you mentioned, Rachel, they've got lots of discretions in the present laws. So, the fact that we have national standards, they might be watered down or not taken into account very effectively. So,
absolutely, and I think they shouldn't not just take them into account. You want decisions to be made consistent with national standards to actually deliver them, because one of the problems with the current Act is it's so discretionary. You have a long list where you can just tick, yes, I've considered that, I've had regard to that, and I've made this decision. We need something where decision makers, right down to the project level, at the regional planning level, at a range of different decision points, actually have to demonstrate how their decision meets a new national environmental standard. And we need, an independent EPA to police that, to make sure it's actually enforced and it's actually working at all levels.
Wonderful. Well, everybody, it's been a fantastic night, and I really appreciate our panel for coming together. It's been a delight to hear such incredibly smart, intelligent women talk about really complex stuff. And if everybody could put their hands together and thank our wonderful panel. And I'm sure if you want to just wrap up and talk about your ongoing Law and Nature dialogue.
Thank you, Nick. Everyone, let's also round of applause for Nick as well for sharing with us. Again, so thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Those of you online as well. I'm sorry we didn't get to seem to be quite a few things in chat. I was keeping a monitor on that, and thank you for the comments. I wasn't sure if there were any questions that came through, and apologies if so. We just had, you know, such a rich and vibrant discussion in the room. So yeah, to wrap up, thank you to everyone as well from CEL. Thank you to all the volunteers. The next Law and Nature Dialogue will be in October. Yeah, 12th of October. 12th of October, and the topic will be ecocide. The chair will be the Honourable Brian Preston, and we very much look forward to seeing you all again, in person, online, whatever it is. And yeah, thank you, Ian. Good perspectives, everyone. And yeah, I would just like to say again that what we're trying to do with the dialogues is really gain this variety of perspectives, and I think that was represented on the panel this evening. But the commonality between all three of the panelists was, of course, at the end of the day, and of course Nick himself, end of the day, a commitment to ensuring that our laws promote environmental protection. And I think that's a yeah, probably a good note to sign off on. So thank you again to everyone. Thank you to our panelists, and everyone have a good evening, and get something to eat as well. There's still some food out there.